Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Treks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight is December the 7th, 2015, getting closer and closer to the Christmas holidays, and we are watching the world heat up in preparation for what might be World War III in the Middle East if things aren't dealt with soon. We've also got a number of developments that we're going to talk about tonight as well. Going to be all over the map tonight. Before we really begin discussing the news and the situations that we want to cover and the analysis that we need to present, I want to mention that for the new listeners, if you're just joining us tonight here for the first time, you can catch Truth on the Tracks every Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on ucy.tv, and you can access the show's personal webpage, ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks. You can keep track of my work at a number of different websites. Like activistpost.com, naturalblaze.com, and of course my own website, brandonturbeville.com. And if you're interested in my work specifically, then I would encourage you to go to brandonturbeville.com. That is the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all of the archive versions of this show. All of the relevant information is there. And of course, the books are available at brandonturbeville.com. We're going to get those up there as well. A lot of them are already available, but there's going to be some less expensive options for these books as well that you'll be able to purchase them on Amazon. So keep checking back. Slow going on that, but they're going to get done, and we're going to engage in some more improvements to the site as well. So we'll get that done. BrandonTurbeville.com is where you need to go. Now, before we get involved in any of these different topics tonight, a word on the San Bernardino shootings. Okay, since this has been on the lips of every person watching the mainstream media, the San Bernardino shooting, we're not going to go into detail about this. This is not going to be the false flag shooting show. This is not going to be anything like that, because you can't waste your time following every single false flag shooting around and exposing it but without being drawn off target. Now, of course, that needs to be done for some people. That does need to be done. There needs to be someone out there exposing these false flag shootings, each and every one, and there are people out there doing that. We commend them. We encourage them to continue, but this show, we can't do that here. For this purpose, let's just suffice it to say that the shooting was indeed a false flag, and we already know that there are drills at the same time as the shooting in the same general location. That tells you all you need to know. So, false flag, absolutely. What was the purpose here? Of course, we see a volley of comments coming out of the mainstream media regarding guns. Gun control. It's because crazy gun nuts have gotten control of guns, and they've gone out and they've committed a murder. Remember, the mainstream media was already reporting that it was right-wing militia fighters and right-wing extremists who were killing people. It turns out it was nothing of the sort. But now the propaganda is, of course, the Muslim paranoia, the Islamophobia, the whining about Islam, and the fear-mongering of terrorists under every bed. So this is, of course, a false flag, and it's designed to not only drum up fear, not only drum up support for war, but it's designed to draw up support for increased gun control. So now we get speeches by people like Barack Obama, who constantly recycles his speech. Every time there's one of these engineered mass shootings, he recycles a speech and talks about how tired he is of speaking about the mass shootings, and we just have to disarm America to prevent them. This coming from a mass murderer who's killed hundreds of thousands of people, innocent men, women, and children all across the world. He's going to lecture the United States and people of the United States and tell them to disarm themselves because of a mass shooting in California. I'm sorry. If Obama is tired of giving the speeches, then he should just shut up, because we're tired of hearing them. Now, that being said, we need to move on to some other topics. I'm going to get, of course, to the geopolitical situation, and that's important. But I also want to discuss a number of different issues that have cropped up too. Speaking of guns, since we just mentioned the gun situation, there's an important article by Amanda Warren on Activist Post. Despite shooting attacks on U.S. soldiers, government says no guns for you. This is somewhat relevant. The fiscal 2016 Defense Authorization Bill is attempting to include language that will allow commanders of military installations more authority and choice over who is able to carry what they call an appropriate firearm or, quote, some personal weapons. There is some significant support for this legislation. There's the lawmakers supporting it. They've written in a report, this is what they say, quote, we remain concerned about the response times to active shooter attacks on U.S. military installations and facilities. Commanders should take steps to arm additional personnel if they believe that arming those personnel will contribute to that goal, end quote. So there's also support from pro-gun activists, organizations. NRA is supporting it, and that's a good idea. Obviously, the idea is to arm U.S. military service personnel on base in order to prevent a repeat of some of the things that have happened in the past where soldiers have been targeted. The provisions in that bill, though, require the Secretary of Defense to establish the relevant policy by the end of the year. And there's two problems with this. First, the 2016 Defense Authorization Bill might not even pass to begin with. We've got this bickering over unrelated budget matters between the Democrats and the Republicans and the Obama administration that could see the bill being dead on arrival. In addition to that, a presidential veto has already been promised. Right? If the budget controversy isn't solved, he plans to veto it. And then we also have got the bill putting the responsibility for a new policy on the shoulders of the Defense Department, and the Defense Department has already argued against the policy, so it's likely that any policy changes would be effectively neutralized by the anti-gun Defense Department. So the Pentagon seems to be entrenched in this view. We've got Pentagon spokesman Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Crossan saying that the department does not support arming all personnel because, quote, safety concerns, the prohibitive cost of use of force and weapons training and qualification costs, end quote. So they don't mind arming the soldiers being shipped overseas to secure oil fields or oil pipelines and geostrategic positioning, but at home when they're actually threatened by psychotic killers, that's not going to be allowed. So basically the White House is responding to American military personnel who might be worried about being victims of mass shootings. No guns for you. So that's the position of the Pentagon. Now, I want to do a word about McDonald's, if I can. There are times when a corporation comes up with a marketing strategy that is so aggressive you just have to ask why and who came up with this. And not surprisingly, this is exactly what McDonald's has done with their new program called McTeachers program. It's a clever act of marketing that involves enlisting school teachers as employees and then using them as walking billboards, placing them in high school buildings. The McTeachers program employees, and I put employees in scare quotes, volunteer teachers during the evening hours as a fundraising event. So you get students and parents and other school supporters are urged to then come out and patronize McDonald's on the evening that their teacher's working so everyone can see their teachers serving up the food. McDonald's USA claims that schools typically receive between about 10 and 20% of the proceeds toward their fundraisers. Some of it depends on the participating franchises. This program, however, has angered a number of parents and education and teachers organizations, as well as corporate and education watchdog groups. These groups agree that the program essentially turns teachers into walking billboards for McDonald's, and that it promotes an unhealthy diet and consumption of fast food. Obviously it does. Corporate Accountability International and Campaign for a Commercial-Free Childhood stated, quote, it is wrong to enlist teachers to sell kids on a brand like McDonald's whose core products are burgers, fries, and soda. Marketing junk food to children is a harmful practice. We are in the midst of the largest preventable health crisis in the U.S., one that is spreading throughout the world and that increasingly affects children. If this trend is not reversed, many children will be burdened with diet-related diseases like obesity and type 2 diabetes, affecting their health for life. Health professionals on the front lines of treating these diseases have long urged you to stop targeting children. The World Health Organization and the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends restrictions on junk food marketing to children. Study after study from esteemed organizations such as the Institute of Medicine and the National Bureau of Economic Research suggests that junk food marketing targeted at kids is a serious health concern. McTeacher's Nights undermine these important efforts, exploiting educators' authority and popularity to lure kids to McDonald's. Transforming teachers into McDonald's marketers is particularly egregious in light of a recent study in clinical pediatrics linking fast food consumption with lower educational outcomes. And here is the McDonald's response. McTeacher's Nights are all about community fun and fundraising. As parents and members of their communities, McDonald's franchises and our corporate restaurants have long supported what matters most to them. McTeacher's Nights are one example. Teachers and parent-teacher organizations have a choice in how they seek to raise additional funds, and for years they have told McDonald's and franchisees that in addition to the extra financial support these events provide for their schools, they have a great time connecting with their students and neighbors, end quote. Now, McDonald's actually makes a few reasonable points here. Nobody's being forced to do this, and these teachers volunteer to take part in the program. But as the teachers groups point out, no one's going to seriously argue that the program is anything but a stealth marketing campaign aimed at a captive audience of children and young people. Of course, McDonald's attempts to present itself as maintaining a commitment to America's youth and public schools. The truth is that, like any other business, McDonald's has a commitment to only one thing, and that is profit. So a corporation who only recently stated that it was going to resume marketing to children and families now finds itself in the midst of an institution that is central to the lives of both. Big coincidence, right? If McDonald's was truly committed to America's schools, it could have simply donated the money with no strings attached. If it wanted compensation for those donations, it could have marketed itself as a proud sponsor of the school. But instead, McDonald's went full corporate America, and now they've attempted to advertise and capitalize and profit off of a marketing campaign aimed at children. So just take a look at that. I mean, I don't know what else I can say about the McDonald's marketing campaign. One more thing on McDonald's. There's another marketing campaign. If ever a massive food corporation had no shame, it would be McDonald's. And in addition to paying their workers slave wages and doing everything in their power to milk their employees for time and money, selling some of the world's worst quality food, and as well as their aggressive and shameless marketing strategies, among many other negative qualities, McDonald's has announced late last month in October, that they are engaging in another marketing ploy designed to deflect any responsibility for the quality of its food and for staggering rates of obesity. So fresh on the heels of that McTeacher's Nights program that I just came up with, where the teachers volunteer to work the night shift, we now have something else. We have McDonald's with these brand ambassadors, right? That we got a brand ambassador on the road attempting to convince high school and college students that not only does McDonald's and their products not cause obesity, but it is possible to actually lose weight by consuming it 3 times a day. Now, to be fair, eating at McDonald's for most people is a personal choice. Absolutely, there are also people, of course, that you can't deny eat at a fast food restaurant chain as a necessity, but regardless, you'd find it hard to blame a food retailer or a restaurant for the choices made by individuals. Fine. It's just this type of aggressive, false, and malicious advertising, along with the treacherous business practices, that makes McDonald's so dangerous and such a poster boy for these typical out-of-control corporations as they're presented. So take this Iowa teacher. His name is John Cisna. He's a brand ambassador. His time and travel are paid for by McDonald's, and he is promoting his McDonald's diet, and that consists of eating nothing but McDonald's food for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for 90 days straight as a way to lose weight. And his message is that, quote, you can lose weight while still eating the foods you love, like Big Macs and hot fudge sundaes. Cisna claims that he started off at 280 pounds and attributes a lot of his weight issue to eating home-cooked meals and food prepared at sit-down restaurants. He claims his new diet revolved around eating about 2,000 calories per day at McDonald's, which he says shows there's no such thing as bad food. There's currently no mention, however, of how much Cisna currently weighs. That's the type of thing these media propaganda pieces typically leave out. He says he lost weight, but how much does he actually weigh and how much did he weigh? That was ignored. Cisna's argument basically revolves around the idea that it's not the type of food you eat, it's the size of the portions. Now, Cisna and McDonald's are correct when they state that the portion size is a major player in an individual's weight gain. Without a doubt. Right, eating 2 French fries from McDonald's versus a full meal in a sit-down restaurant that serves actual food would likely see a person lose weight. A steady consumption of cocaine and meth would also see someone lose weight even faster, but nobody in their right mind suggesting that anybody do something like that. So simply starving yourself is not an answer to the incredibly unhealthy food served at McDonald's and chains like it. Now, it may seem like heresy to some people, but aside from the gallon-sized drinks served at fast food chains, the portions at fast food restaurants really aren't that big. The fries are average portions if you go large. The sandwiches are quite small, but they still pack quite a punch on your health. The fact that food portions of this size can cause such detrimental effects on health should speak volumes alone. So Cisna's McDonald's speaking tour is nothing more than this treacherous attempt at remarketing to children and families, an admitted goal of McDonald's going forward, since their last marketing effort didn't draw in as much revenue as the corporation had hoped for. So both the McTeacher's Night program and Cisna's brand ambassador speaking tour, they're clever, or not so clever, depending on what audience you're talking to. It's attempting to attract and target audiences of high schoolers, children, and young adults, and that's exactly what they're doing. Apparently they want to ensure that the next generation, the next Mick generation, is as McFat and un-McHealthy as the last one, I suppose. So there's that. Now, I want to continue discussing. We mentioned the World Health Organization, and we're going to get to the geopolitical stuff fairly soon, but this is stuff that I've been wanting to mention for some time. I figured now is a good time to get it out. The World Health Organization report that processed meats are linked to cancer. Let's just go through this, and then we'll discuss about the reaction that met this report in the alternative media, because I think the reaction is almost as important as the report. Now, the World Health Organization announced in late October that cured and processed meats like hot dogs, ham, bacon, sausage, all that stuff is part of a top-tier list of carcinogenic substances. And this really confirms what a lot of people in the natural health community have known for some time. Basically, that America's favorite breakfast foods are in the same category as cigarettes and alcohol and asbestos and arsenic. The World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer is bundling processed meats with the other listed carcinogens because of their documented link to bowel cancer. Now, we're not trying to suggest that the sausage links cause cancer at the same rate as asbestos exposure, but cancer cause they do. The IARC epidemiologist Dr. Kurt Strafe stated, quote, "For an individual, the risk of developing colorectal bowel cancer because of their consumption of processed meat remains small, but the risk increases with the amount of meat consumed." Okay, in quotes. That's a real problem for Americans. The IARC estimates that a daily portion of 50 grams of processed meat increases the risk for bowel cancer by 18%. So that's about equal to 3 slices of cooked bacon. The report goes even further, links red meat to cancer, classifies beef, lamb, and pork as probable carcinogens, placing red meat in the same list as glyphosate. The findings are based on more than 800 studies. They're already receiving criticism from the meat industry. I think a lot of listeners might find it interesting to know that the American bacon craze that swept the culture, especially via the internet, this weird psychosexual obsession with bacon that Americans tend to have, particularly American males, white American males especially, was a manufactured marketing play by the industry. It worked. It catapulted the processed bacon industry into the $4 billion annual industry, and it helped prompt more factory farms. Now, the IARC is falling back on the extensive study on the lifestyle and environmental risks regarding red meat consumption and connections to cancer, and this is what the study states. In making this evaluation, the working group took into consideration all the relevant data, including the substantial epidemiological data showing a positive association between the consumption of red meat and colorectal cancer and the strong mechanistic evidence. Consumption of red meat positively associated with pancreatic and prostate cancer. Now, all right, there we have that. The links between cancer and processed and red meats have been studied in the past. In 2013, we had researchers at the University of Zurich finding that consumption of processed meats increased the risk of death from both heart disease and cancer. British Journal of Cancer study published in 2012 linked processed meats such as bacon and sausage to an increased risk of pancreatic cancer. Some of the most dangerous ingredients in processed meats, of course, are the preservatives, the nitrites. Cancer Research Center of Hawaii conducted a study, and the University of Southern California suggested links between eating processed meats and cancer, especially pancreatic cancer. The study concluded that the individuals who ate the most processed meats had a 67% higher risk of contracting pancreatic cancer than those at the other end of the spectrum. So considering the fact that the average American eats around 18 pounds of bacon every year, the connection between processed meats and cancer is concerning. So with the meat industry increasingly becoming one of horrific production methods and increasing chemical preservative-based distribution, the latest report really stands as just one more example about how the Western diet is becoming increasingly deadly. Now, before we move on to the geopolitical stuff, I want to mention the reaction that was received, or the reaction that was provided by the alternative media when this story came out. This study, granted it was by the World Health Organization, but this study essentially confirmed what the natural health people have been saying for decades, right? That processed meats contribute to cancer. Yet in the alternative media, you saw a number of reactions. The reaction was overwhelmingly that the World Health Organization globalists are trying to force us to not eat meat, and the other reaction was that it's not true. There's no connection between cancer and processed meats. Well, I'm sorry. There is a documented connection between cancer and processed meats. You all were just peddling that line only months ago, and as soon as the World Health Organization stated it, you changed your position. The first problem is that you have meat-obsessed, carnivorous-obsessed individuals in the alternative media who believe that your diet should consist of meat, and nothing but meat. Well, I'm sorry, that's just not the way the human diet was designed. We're not going to get into the whole debate over human diet. But what I will say, for the alternative media, you've proven two things. You've proven, one, that you don't mind shifting your position, and you don't know when you've done it. The alternative media, by and large, had promoted the idea that processed meats caused cancer prior to the report. The day the report was released, the alternative media shifted and is now saying processed meats are fine, processed meats are good for you. So that shows you also how easily controlled the alternative media it is. In other words, how if you're always reacting in a knee-jerk fashion, well, if this person's against it, then I should be for it, and vice versa, then you're easily controlled by your emotions and by your lack of research. I'm no fan of the World Health Organization. I refer you to my book, Codex Alimentarius, The End of Health Freedom, where I rip the World Health Organization apart. I'm no fan of that organization, but in this instance, they are right to point out that processed meats cause cancer, and no hysteria from the alternative media will change that. The issue is, does it cause cancer or not whether or not these organizations want to do anything about it. Now, if you say that there's an ulterior motive on the part of the World Health Organization, well, sure, I won't deny that. but you can't deny that there's a link between processed meats and cancer. And just because you fell for a mainstream media corporate advertising campaign to tell you that pork and processed meats were good for you and that it made you more of a man the more you ate of it, that's not my problem, and it's not the problem of the rest of the world. So you guys need to get it together there in the rest of the alternative media. Now, on to the geopolitical portion of the show. We've got to talk about what has been happening in Russia and Syria and Turkey. There's been a number of things that had happened. We discussed the downing of the Russian jet last week on the show. Of course, we all know what happened. There's evidence coming from both sides. The Russian jet was shot down by the Turkish military, and the evidence shows, the majority of evidence in this case shows that the jet was actually in Syrian territory and not Turkish territory. It had not crossed the border. It was ridiculous to shoot it down if it had crossed the border. But the plane was largely shot down over Syrian territory. Of course, these paratroopers, these pilots, bailed out of the plane. One of them was killed apparently on the way down in violation of the rules of war, interestingly. The terrorists, well, actually, we'll call them the Turkmen because they are not necessarily on the same level, but they are essentially fanatics. These brigades, these Turkmen brigades, are of course right along with ISIS. They are Turkish descent. They are connected with Turkey. They're being funded by Turkey and supported by Turkey. They work in concert with Turkey, and thus they are part of the death squad machine. They are the ones that shot these pilots. Now, they killed one. One was rescued. The Russians sent a crew in a helicopter to try to get this guy back. They killed a Russian Marine. He was shot in the neck. He died. The Syrian Special Forces actually rescued the pilot and brought him back. So the pilot is now back. And he has confirmed that the plane was never given any warnings and that it was over Syrian territory. So this is an act of war on the part of Turkey. It's a direct act of war, and the Russians are showing incredible restraint. Although there have been sanctions now. There have been a number of sanctions imposed by the Russians against Turkey, and it revolves around travel, some economic style sanctions, but in terms of military response, there's been very little, except for the placement of the S-400 missile defense systems, which are extremely, extremely new and effective. Right? These are probably the most advanced systems on the market, and now they're in Turkey. The Russians brought them in. They said there will be no repeat of the downing of the Russian jet. Of course, we now have to look at Turkey, and I think we'll spend some time on this. On the Turkish question, and we discussed is whether or not Turkey was the real ISIS on the last show, I do believe, and we didn't get through the whole presentation, but we'll try to get through as much of that as possible. So let's just talk about what Turkey is and what they do, and their support for terrorism. It's been one of the most fervent supporters of terror in Syria since the beginning of the crisis. It's consistently allowed its territory to be used as a staging ground for ISIS, for Nusra, for other terrorist groups to enter Syria for the purpose of destroying the government of Assad. We have, of course, Turkey issuing more than 100,000 fake Turkish passports that were given to ISIS. Erdogan's government has been accused of supporting the terrorist organization for a while, turning its blind eye to the militants crossing the border and even buying its oil. It's actually pushed these terrorists in there. We won't go through all of the points that we tried to make the last time. In fact, if you want to get a good idea, I've written an article that's very good. It's entitled, "Is Turkey the Real ISIS?" And I would encourage you to go look that up and then see what I'm talking about. You can also go back and listen to the archive of the last show. Now, I think we mentioned the Kherson situation, basically NATO provoking Russia in Crimea as well. So we mentioned that on the last show, and I would encourage you to go read that article. Also, we've got an article by Afrad Dogger, the Syrian political analyst, the frequent guest on my show, and she's written a number of articles, op-eds for Activist Post, also being reposted on BrandonTurbeville.com. She's made a few videos with me, and it's called By Way of Deception, How Turkey Considers Its Airspace Violated by Syria, and she goes through many of the things that we discussed last week in terms of the actual details of how the plane itself was over Syrian territory and not over Turkish territory. So I would encourage you to read that as well. Now, here's what I wanted to mention. This is something that's not as well discussed in the media. I went on a couple of radio shows over the last few weeks, and I brought this information out on the air, and I think a lot of people were surprised. I was getting reports from my sources and from my connections to individuals who have reason and the ability to know about what is happening in Syria and Iraq and on the stages of international terror. So my sources were reporting this to me, and now we have more confirmation of what I said being true. In other words, that not only was the U.S. bombing campaign allegedly targeted at ISIS, that not only was it not bombing ISIS, but instead going after Syrian military infrastructure, Syrian civilian infrastructure, but that it was going after nothing at all. In other words, bombing the desert, bombing targets that had been bombed long ago that were already destroyed, or just simply returning back to base. So I think a lot of Americans were and still are increasingly confused by this American impotence against the ISIS terror organization, while the Russians have managed to decimate the jihadists only after a few weeks of steady bombing, right? Obama called the terrorists the JV squad. Well, they're not even the JV squad. You hear these idiotic Republicans screaming about how they're supermen, they're going to take over the world. That's not true. These guys are monkeys, right? They can barely function and tie their own shoes. They are weak. They are a paper tiger. We all know that. So the question to the Republicans is, if they are the supermen, if they are the dangerous supermen who are going to take over the world, why has the Russian bombing campaign only taken a few weeks to utterly destroy them? I would also ask the same question to the left-wingers who consider ISIS nothing really to be worried about. Well, then why aren't you doing anything about it? Why hasn't your bombing campaign after a year or after several months, why hasn't that done anything against ISIS? Why did it take the Russians to do it? Now, the U.S. has demonstrated time and time again that it has the ability to bomb an entire country into the Stone Age, and the capabilities of the U.S. Air Force are not in question, right? We've done that repeatedly. Either ISIS is a congery of supermen and special forces fighters, or the ineffectiveness of the U.S. airstrikes is intentional. And we know that they're not a congery of supermen and special forces fighters because the effectiveness of the Russian bombing has proven otherwise. So, the American malfeasance, is that incompetence? Is that laziness? Or is it something more? Well, it's something more. For what it's worth, the bombings that have taken place, as I mentioned earlier, have been focused on Syrian civilian infrastructure, Syrian military infrastructure, and the like. Russian forces have been dropping bombs and missiles on top of ISIS fighters all across Syria. They've been lobbing cruise missiles across the Caspian, regular sortie missions, combat helicopter attacks, all of these other things against ISIS and other relatively moderate cannibals and terrorists. The U.S. has launched a bombing mission of its own against 2 power plants in Aleppo. These plants were located in Al-Rudwaniya, east of Aleppo, and it resulted in the power outages affecting the Syrian people. It added to the American tradition of bombing civilian infrastructure instead of ISIS and other terrorist targets in Syria. So the power outages only further contributed to the misery surrounding the people of Aleppo, who've been bombarded by barbarians funded by the United States and NATO. These guys who are intent on raping and beheading their way through the city and declaring their caliphate of pre-civilization on civilized people with the money given to them by NATO. So the targeting of Syrian civilian infrastructure is not the only reason that American bombs have avoided ISIS. This is what's important. The U.S. Air Force is refusing to actually target ISIS to begin with. And they're actually returning back to base with their missiles and their bombs intact or having intentionally missed the target altogether. This information, which I said my sources were telling me early on, and which I reported here and in a number of other outlets. But it's being reported more and more now with increasing confirmation. Right? This indicates that the U.S. Air Force pilots have only been using about 25% of their ordnance on targets in Syria, and that includes the bombing of infrastructure that have been taking place. So the U.S. Air Force pilots who've returned from bombing raids in Syria are actually reporting that they're being forced to return back to base with around 75% of their ordnance because they're unable to get clearance to actually launch the strikes. We had the head of Russia's parliamentary International Affairs Committee, Alexei Pushkov. He wrote that the U.S. has actually spent an entire year bombing nothing but the desert as opposed to any ISIS targets. And I agree, Mr. Pushkov. That's what I've been told as well, that they're actually dropping bombs on desert sand and returning to base if they drop bombs at all. It makes a lot of money for the military-industrial complex. Nice work if you can get it. We even had a member of Congress being forced to address the issue at a meeting of the House Foreign Affairs Committee when he spoke with U.S. military leaders about the campaign. Right? He says, this is Ed Royce, he says, you went 12 full months while ISIS was on the march without the U.S. using that air power, and now as the pilots come back to talk to us, as they say, 3/4 of our ordnance we can't drop, we can't get clearance even when we have a clear target in front of us. I don't understand this strategy at all because this is what has allowed ISIS the advantage and ability to recruit. End quote. The Pentagon has the excuse that and this is unconvincing to say the least, that the U.S. is refusing to bomb targets that might endanger the lives of civilians. So it's increasingly difficult for Pentagon officials to say something like that with a straight face, right? They supported a policy of arming terrorists and jihadists to rape and behead civilians across Libya, Syria, Iraq, killing scores of civilians in the process, an invasion that rivals the American massacre of civilians after its invasion of Iraq in 2003. And they're going to say that civilian lives are in danger, and that's why they're not dropping the bombs. Civilian lives rarely enter the equation when it comes to Syria, except for when the propaganda deems it necessary for that to do so. The failure of the American bombing campaign against ISIS, this is a demonstration that there's been no change of heart by the Americans when it comes to ISIS, right? It's created ISIS, it funded ISIS, it armed ISIS, and it used ISIS to fight against Bashar al-Assad. If the United States really wanted to defeat ISIS, it never would have funded it to begin with. At the very least, it would cease to do so now. Bombers would not only return empty-handed, but they would have dealt a severe blow to the Jarablus corridor, which ISIS fighters and equipment continually enters into Syria via Turkey and their Turk facilitators. So there's no American interest in destroying ISIS. The interest lies in continuing to use it as a proxy army against the Syrian government, against Lebanon, against Iran, and ultimately against Russia. It is a very dangerous game. Now, this is not the only instance where we see the United States refusing to bomb ISIS targets. We've also got the oil tankers, the oil trucks of ISIS, and this is interesting, right? We have, ever since the Russians began dropping real bombs on real ISIS targets in Syria, the U.S. and NATO have been forced to engage in this two-sided propaganda campaign that on one hand swears opposition to ISIS while simultaneously doing everything it can to facilitate and protect ISIS forces on the ground. It's also trying to, it's also found itself in this bizarre position of trying to facilitate the Death Squad army while at the same time attempting to play catch-up to the Russians in at least the appearance of bombing ISIS. So when Russian forces truly hit at one of the sources of ISIS funding, in other words, the captured oil being shipped from Syria and Iraq to Turkey, where it's then purchased by Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan's son, Bilal, the U.S. then has to go out and engage in its own phony bombing campaign against ISIS oil trucks. But instead of actually bombing the trucks, drivers and all, and then putting them out of commission permanently, the U.S. bombing campaign takes the form of this laughable formality that involves a 45-minute warning to the oil convoys that a U.S. bombing campaign is about to take place. The warning involves an airdrop of leaflets to the tankers that read, "Get out of your trucks now and run away from them. Warning, airstrikes are coming. Oil trucks will be destroyed. Get away from your oil trucks immediately. Do not risk your life." So the justification is that the drivers of the tankers might be civilians and not actual ISIS members. But there's no mention of the fact that in any other context, any individual who renders material support to terrorists, particularly in the form of driving tankers of stolen oil in a war zone that is then going to be used to fund the terrorist organization itself, that person would be killed without question under that designation under any other context. There's also no mention as to why these potential civilians received ample warning, but the true civilians in Iraq and Syria, for instance, received no such courtesy. It's truly a pity that the U.S. didn't drop leaflets to millions of Iraqis that it killed over the last decade, or the thousands of Libyans that died at the hands of NATO and their bombing campaign. So we need only look at the numbers of the destroyed oil tankers that were racked up by the United States in comparison to the Russians to see a distinct difference. The U.S., according to Colonel Steve Warren, has taken out about 116 tankers since the bombing campaign began. The Russians have eliminated over 1,000 in 5 days. So remember, until the Russians began bombing the oil tankers, the U.S. had yet to launch an attack on the oil tankers. And this is what's even more laughable. The response that came when the U.S. military was questioned as to why they were unable to destroy more trucks than they did after such a highly publicized strategy. Steve Warren, the Army colonel, stated that the American jets simply ran out of ammo in the process. He says, the goal was to destroy every truck there. They ran out of ammunition before they were able to do that. But the desire was to destroy every single truck there, he said. Well, it's funny. Maybe the Russian planes hold more ammo. Maybe they load up. They're fully armed when they leave. The United States didn't have the forethought to think about that. Seems like they did when they invaded Iraq, when they bombed in Libya. But here they seem to not remember to do that. So even with this new attempt to be seen as truly fighting ISIS in the eyes of the gullible American public, the U.S. has been forced to use videos and photographs to show the bombing, right? We had this opportunity by the military to show the bombing campaign, to show the spoils of war, or the results of their bombing campaign, and it shows the oil tankers being blown up and destroyed. It turns out that it's videos and photographs from Russian bombing campaigns, and they're using that across the mainstream media to show the American people what the United States is doing to ISIS. The United States isn't doing that to ISIS. Russia is doing that to ISIS, so the United States has figured out a way to piggyback on Russian videos and use Russian videos for propaganda purposes here in the U.S. This would be funny if it were not so dangerous to all of us. Now, the oil, the stolen oil, we need to talk about the stolen oil for a minute. That's probably what we will focus mostly on here in the latter half of the show. There's been much talked about regarding the Turkish oil. Not the Turkish oil, but the stolen Syrian and Iraqi oil, the ISIS oil, we should say, that goes from Turkey and from Syria and Iraq, into Turkey and then off to other places, most notably the Ashdod region of Israel, the port there. It comes out of the Syrian and Iraqi areas, goes through Turkey, and then off to Ashdod in Israel, and then on from Israel either domestically to Israel or into Europe and European countries. But now here is one of the important aspects of this, right? When this oil gets taken from Syria, it generally goes to Iraq. This is through ISIS territory, and then on up through Iraqi Kurdish territory. These are the Barzani Kurds. These are the Kurds that have connections to American intelligence and some connections to Israeli intelligence, but particularly American intelligence. It's only a stone's throw away if you have a connection to American intelligence anyway. But these Kurds are then able to ship the oil through because the Turks have been buying oil from the Kurds for some time. And technically, according to the Iraqi government and to probably most international business law, this would be illegal because the country of Iraq is still one country, but it's essentially into 3 autonomous zones, right? So almost like a confederacy, but not really. And the oil that comes from the Kurds was there was a dispute between the Kurds and the Iraqi government. The Kurds were demanding that they were not getting the investments that were necessary from the Iraqi central government. The central government was claiming that the Kurds were not living up to their end of the bargain on some of the things that they were supposed to do, and as a result, the Iraqis cut off funding to the Kurds. Well, as a result of that, the Kurds started shipping their oil regardless of what the central government wanted, and essentially it was paying duties back to the central government that the Kurds did not do that got a lot of this stuff started. And it's kind of the chicken or the egg. Was it the Iraqi central government that was not investing properly? Was it the Kurds who were not paying the right amount of taxes or duties percentage-wise on their oil? Regardless, this has been a fight that has continued, right, with the Iraqi government pulling back the investment, the Kurds refusing to pay the duties on the oil. So now they extract it, they sell it to Turkey, Turkey buys it, and they pay the Barzani Kurds. Okay, this is interesting, but we don't have time to go into all the details of this. But now with the oil coming from ISIS, right, if it comes up through the Syria and Iraqi areas and it goes through the Barzani Kurds, this oil is then able to be sort of shipped out undercover as if it were just more illegal Kurdish oil. It just goes under the wayside. It goes under the radar, rather. And then from Turkey, it gets taken all the way to Israel and then on to other countries. Now, Afra Dogger, she's got more of that information. The oil mafia, stolen oil from Syria and Iraq, taken to Kurdistan, Turkey, and Israel. She documents some of that in her article. It's up at BrandonTurbeville.com. It's up at ActivistPost.com. She talks about some of the details. The Islamic State in Syria and the Levant, ISIL, she refers to them as. She also goes through the logistics of taking the oil all the way to Israel from Syria and Iraq. So basically, oil tankers come from Syria and Iraq to Zakko, which is the Turkish city located close to the Sirnak province. Both are on the borders with Syria and Iraq. And each convoy consists of about 70 to 100 tankers. On the other side of the border, the oil smuggling mafias basically are waiting for these convoys and the oil that they bring. And the oil smugglers consist of merchants from Syria, from Iraq, from Turkey, and of course the Kurds, as well as other nationalities, possibly even Iranian there as well. And all of these groups are not national, but they're not nationalists. They are sympathetic to the terrorists themselves. And the one who's directly responsible for the oil cargo sells it to the highest bidder, and takes part of the price in dollars, and then we have some of the drivers receiving the empty oil tankers and returning back with it, with some of the others who have an official license take the full tankers, transfer it into Turkey. There is a source coming from the Iraqi Interior Ministry, who is not going to give his name, who has corroborated all of this. Now, when the stolen oil is sold, it is subject to a preliminary refining. It is then brought to Turkey as a waste product through Ibrahim Khalil, that crossing there, which is a single gate. This is the border between Turkey and Iraq, which is strongly held by Turkish troops, and it's also constantly being flown over. There's checkpoints. Nobody can cross it without the knowledge and permission of the Turkish government and the Turkish military, in other words. So when oil enters the Turkish town of Silopi, the Iraqi oil smugglers, they'll get their money. And they receive this money reportedly by an Israeli-Greek dual citizen. He's a Greek national, but he's a dual citizen with the Israelis. His name is Haj Farid, or Dr. Farid, they call him. Dr. Farid is this Israeli broker, and he's one of the ones who coordinates between the mafias, which stole the oil, and the three main companies who receive it and buy it and transport it to the Turkish ports. And these Turkish ports are Dortyol, Cihan, and Mersin. In order to ship the oil to Israel via these oil tankers, they use the station of the Syrian Iraqi oil would have to be Ashdod, right? It would have to go to Ashdod. The rest of the money, of course, would be then sent to the terrorists in Syria and Iraq and in other ways. And I don't want to get bogged down in the details of that. But the process isn't new. It's been taking place since the beginning of this so-called Arab Spring, where the same terrorists, we also should note that the Al-Nusra Front is active in these areas with the stolen oil. They're inking deals with local tribes there, and they're controlling as many oil fields as they can. Several of them remain where they have unclear ownership, and that's allowed the illicit trade to flourish. That was even reported by Al Jazeera, which is basically a mouthpiece for the monkeys and the Saudi royal family, scarcely distinguishable from each other. The other point we should mention is that the terrorist groups that never seem to attack central oil fields in the south of Iraq, where British and American companies have their rights, but in the north of Syria and Iraq, those terrorists are a real threat. So that is how the shipping of the oil, the ISIS oil, goes through. Now, we're not going to pretend for a minute that ISIS is funded entirely by its oil sales, because it's not. That's a fantasy. It's funded by the Saudi Arabians, it's funded by the Turks, it's funded by the Jordanians, basically the Gulf Cooperation Council, and NATO, particularly the United States. We cannot forget that. They are not a self-sustaining country. Just because they call themselves the Islamic State, what does that mean? Nothing. They're not self-sustaining. They don't fund themselves through wealthy Islamists. They don't fund themselves through Twitter donations, and they don't fund themselves through oil. Now, they can get a little money from that, but that's not how they fund themselves. They fund themselves because they're bankrolled by the West, by the GCC, and by Israel. And this is on record. Now, I want to see if I can get this out, if I can. Bilal Erdogan, right? This is the son of Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, the president of Turkey. ISIS funding is being presented as a mystery to the Western world, right? The gullible public, they just think it's Twitter donations and wealthy Islamists, as I just said. We reject the Twitter claims out of hand, because it's well known that if you want to go out and protest the Federal Reserve, if you want to go out and protest for legalization of marijuana, your Twitter account can be shut down. But if you're a terrorist, for some reason, that is not an option. That never happens. And it's true, I guess we could say, that wealthy Islamists are assisting in the funding of ISIS, because they're known as the royal family of Saudi Arabia and the emirs of Qatar and Kuwait and other Gulf state feudal monarchies, the negation of civilization. pre-civilization societies, I guess we should say. But the question of the oil business, ISIS oil business, that's another one entirely. The mainstream media obviously exaggerates the ability of ISIS to extract and ship and collect all this oil to fund itself, particularly in a way that's under the nose of the world's most effective surveillance and military states. So ISIS is no doubt selling the oil to foreign powers, and it's being exaggerated a bit in terms of what they actually get in return. What we're interested in here is not so much what they're trying to sell and how they sell it, as who is buying it. And that is one of the biggest questions. ISIS is not engaging in these oil deals without the knowledge of NATO, since it's precisely NATO that it's doing business with. One of the principal smugglers conducting business with ISIS is Bilal Erdogan, and this is the guy I want to mention. Bilal Erdogan owns several maritime companies. He's allegedly signed contracts with European operating companies to carry Iraqi stolen oil to different Asian countries. And the Turkish government buys Iraqi plundered oil, which is being produced from the Iraqi seized oil wells. Bilal is his maritime companies own special wharfs in Beirut and Cayenne that are used to transport these crude oil shipments, also to Japan. Now, the vice president of the Turkish Republican People's Party, the CHP, Gürsel Tekin, has even stated on record that the oil was being smuggled into Turkey via BMZ, which is a shipping company owned by Bilal Erdogan. He said that, quote, President Erdogan claims that according to international transportation conventions, there is no legal infraction concerning Bilal's illicit activities, and his son is doing an ordinary business with the registered Japanese companies. But in fact, Bilal Erdogan is up to his neck in complicity with terrorism, but as long as his father holds office, he will be immune from any judicial prosecution. He also said, a family business and President Erdogan's close relatives hold shares in BMZ, and they misused public funds and took illicit loans from Turkish banks, end quote. So Mr. Tekin is treading on thin ice there in the wonderful liberal democracy of Turkey, where you can be destroyed, imprisoned, or killed for questioning the autocrat of the Erdogans. But hey, it's a NATO country. They're friendly with America. They must be a democracy. So, why haven't the U.S. and its coalition gone after the source of ISIS funding? Why haven't they tried to degrade and destroy ISIL by addressing the fact that members of NATO are not only buying the oil stolen by ISIS and paying ISIS money that's going to be used to support its mission in Syria and Iraq, but addressing the fact that one of the main smugglers is the son of the president of a NATO country? Couldn't NATO at least request that Erdogan ask his son to refrain from funding ISIS when we see them as the end of the world? The reason for this is the lack of interest in fighting ISIS to begin with. The United States does not want to destroy ISIS at all. They want to continue to use it as the proxy army. So as it stands, the stolen oil is going to continue to cross the Turkish border and head to Israel and Japan and other countries unless it's stopped by the Russians or the Syrian army, because the United States certainly isn't going to do it. NATO's not going to do it. The Erdogan family seems to continue to enrich itself at the expense of civilization, and the true source of funding for ISIS is going to go unmolested because it's coming from NATO. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk more about this and a number of other topics next week. Stick with us. We're really got a lot of stuff to cover. Next week we're going to talk about the geopolitical situation and the domestic situation. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Truth on the Tracks. I am Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
You are listening to UCY.TV. Why don't you stick around for more awesome radio?